Hello and welcome back to another video. I'm Zelp, and today we are continuing the critical sort of like talks in Warframe. Actually, now that I think about it, it kind of applies in most games as well. As long as you know the critical chance and the critical multiplier, you can actually use this for any game. Now I do like to let you guys know why I was absent a few days. My computer just keep failing. I couldn't record. I have trouble opening the editor. Everything was just really bad. I've reformatted a total of 4 to 5 times to the point where I was kind of convinced that it was the SSD, the hard drive, that is giving the problem. But then we did a check and it seems to be okay. So it's still somewhat the software, the OS, that's giving problem. And I didn't know what I was doing wrong. Turns out, just a quick side note here, turns out that if you were to reset your computer with this function over here, under recovery and reset, it reinstalls the Windows and stuff, but there are still things in the hard drive that is not removed. And it's really weird because there are options saying that do you want to have a clean removal of all these things, and I did that multiple times. Turns out it doesn't work. You have to do it the old-fashioned way, where you actually go out and boot from a operating tool, install in a CD or thumb drive. Make sure you delete all the partitions and then reselect where you're going to put your Windows. But then again, my computer is not like the best thing in the world, so it's still somewhat slow at times, but it's way better than before. It stopped crashing. There was even a point where I could not turn on the computer. That was freaky, because considering the whole COVID-19 thing, it's not like I can go out and fix it. It's not like I can go buy a new one. So it was terrifying. Thank God it is somewhat resolved. Okay, so let's continue. In our last episode, we talked about how I were to change, critical chance and critical damage into a certain value that you can see as a multiplier, and that is pretty much this multiplier over here, 1.25. When you have point strike and also vital sense on, you get this amount. Now if you don't know what I'm talking about, you might need to look at that video, but I told you the method or the idea behind it, but I didn't actually show you guys how I were to write a code about it. So today I'm gonna show you guys how I do that. So the first thing is you actually want to find the average damage done per hit. So if I do not crit, then my average damage is 10 in this case, right? Where I do 10 damage attacks. So I add them all up and I divide it by 10 and I would still get 10. But if you have a 20% critical chance and 2 of those hits is going to do 200% critical damage, which is double, so you do 20 damage and the rest is going to be 10 as well. If you add everything up together, you have 120. Now if you divide that by 10, because it's 10 hits, then you'll actually get 12. So 12 is your average damage per hit. You'll realize that if you take the average damage per hit from when you have critical and when you don't have critical, you can also do the comparison of how much damage has increased because of critical. So now I need to find a code to find the average when it crits. So first I need to look at the amount of chance that it crit, so 20%. Okay, 20% that's gonna crit, and then that means that 80% of the time is not gonna crit. So basically 20% of the damage is going to increase by 200%, and then 80% of the damage is still going to be 100%. So if I were to write a code, it's going to be 20% multiplied by the critical multiplier, because it's going to crit at 20% of the time, which in this case is 2, and then after that I need to add with the other side, which doesn't crit, which is 80% of the time, and is going to do a damage multiplier of 1. Or technically I don't really need to add this, and I have this much. So all I have to do now is add them both together, and what you'll get equals to this plus this. You get 1.2. And since your original damage is 100%, So therefore this is 120%, this is 100%, and you find the difference here, you'll also get a 20% increase. So all you have to do is really just find when it doesn't crit, add when it crits, and then you have a value that you can use to sort of like justify your critical damage. So once again, if I were to write it out, it's going to be a bracket. I like putting brackets so that I know, or it just looks a little bit neater. The critical chance times the critical multiplier, close bracket, and then plus the chance of not critting, and then multiply by how much its original damage is going to be, right? And that is how I'm going to write the code. Now, but today's video is not just about how I'm going to write the code for what I did in the last video. Today we are going to talk about tier. So critical, they have different tiers. If you come over to wiki, you'll see this critical tier. It has a table on it. Basically what it's trying to say is that whenever it passes 100% critical chance, you'll start doing all yellow crits, but any extra critical chance after 100% is going to give you an extra chance to do orange crits. And orange crits has a different damage multiplier that is represented by this formula over here. So you have to implement this particular formula into our sort of like calculation, so that in case if our critical chance go beyond 100% or maybe even beyond 200%, we actually have a different damage outcome that will change as well. So it's a little bit special because it's the critical chance that's affecting the damage of your critical multiplier. That's why we really need to use the formula into this. Another thing that I want to point out, I feel like I need to explain every part of it, is that if you go beyond 200% critical chance, then you'll always be doing orange crits, and then you have a slight chance or a higher chance of doing red crits. So one example is that, let's say you have 250% critical chance. So you'll always do orange crit, but you have a 50% chance of doing a red crit. And if you have 350% critical chance, then you'll always do red crits, but there is a 50% that you'll do a even higher tier of red crit. So it really depends on how many 100% that you sort of like come across. Okay, so let's come back to this spreadsheet. So for this, it's a little bit more tidier. What I did was I changed what we learned just now in the first spreadsheet. I made it into sort of like a system thing where, you know, the peach color is where you put in your values. This is the mods. So if you have Point Strike and Vital Sense, you're gonna put the numbers here. You know, this one gives you an extra 150%. This is 120% for Vital Sense critical multiplier, and this is your weapon. So if your weapon has 20% critical chance and it has 2 times multiplier, critical multiplier, then it's just going to put it in, and it's going to combine them, you know, after modding to give you the new critical chance and the new critical damage. Based on this, it will then calculate the values or the amount percentage increase. Now, one thing a little bit different is that I assume that the damage that I'll be doing is 100. So if you look over at the first spreadsheet, we didn't assume anything. We didn't even put in a damage value. We just calculate sort of like the percentage of damage that I'll be doing. So this will be 40%, this will be 80%, add together get 120%, and based off that. But what I did in this spreadsheet is that I put 100 damage, so I'll be doing 100 damage, and this 100 damage kind of represents the percentage as well, because if you think of it in a way, you can say that this is 80% of the damage, this is 40% damage. I just thought that it would look a lot nicer than to see normal damage 0.8, critical damage 0.4 kind of thing. So this is what I did. Now this part is where there is no mods. Okay, so without the mods, if you look over here, we are actually dealing with this, where it's only based off the base values of critical and critical damage of the weapon, and then after that is with mods and how much more. Now the reason why it's important to have this step over here is because the weapon itself has its own critical chance and critical damage, and we need to take into account this value when we calculate the increase in ratio when we add the mod. because this is the default. When it has its default weapon, yes, this much. So if we do not do this and we put a ratio between this and let's say 100 damage, then we are neglecting the fact that the weapon itself already actually increases its damage because of its initial critical chance and critical damage. So that's why we have to calculate what is the damage increase when it does not have any mod, so that you know when you apply this two critical mods on, what is the impact done to it. And you actually see it over here, it actually increases by 1.25, and the way I do this is I compare this two in a sense of a ratio, and then -1 for reasons that was already explained in the last video. Okay, so this is the top part. Now we go into the part where there is critical tier. So for critical tier, we have to, it's actually the exact same thing. If you look over here and over here, it's the exact same thing, but we added something extra. We have critical tier, okay, the number of what tier you are, and then we have the new critical chance after the critical tier, and then also a new critical damage after reaching a certain critical tier. So this is going to be like a backup information so that you can apply into this one so that you can run the numbers. Now the tricky part is that if you look at the formula consists of some variables like critical tier. So we need to define what tier it is. Otherwise, if you can't tell what tier it is, we cannot use it in the formula. So what I realized is that the critical tier is actually just the critical chance after modding without decimals. So if you look at this, it's 1 when the critical chance in total is 125%. If it's 225%, it's going to be in critical tier 2. If it's 0.25, then it's going to be at a critical tier of 0, as seen over here. So what I pretty much did to get this number is that I round down the value of the critical chance. So based on this, if it's 1.25, running it down without decimals, you're gonna get 1. And if this one goes up even higher, for example, let's say if I were to put in here, I don't know, 2, then now he has a total critical chance of 5, and it's gonna give a critical tier of 5. Let me try something a little bit more logical. Okay, so there. So it has 3.75, but then it only displays 3 because it entered the third critical tier. So this is how we managed to solve the critical tier value. And then for the modded critical multiplier, it's just over here. It's very simple. And then from just this simple equation, we can find the new critical multiplier, which will be applied to the new 2 critical damage. And the critical chance now is the remaining critical chance after removing all the extra 100%. Okay, so what does this mean is that the critical tier takes the first digit without decimals, and the critical chance, the new critical chance, is actually just everything that is not the first digit. That means all the values displayed in the decimal part. So in this case, it's 0.25. If I were to put something like just now 1.5, then you can see that even though it's 3.75, here is 0.75 and here is 3. So this too is a little bit tricky, and the way I do this one is really simple. I just take the critical chance minus off the critical tier. It's kind of a cheating because I didn't really get this by itself. I rely on the critical tier and then sort of like get it. But in my opinion, it's just a creative and smart way of doing things. It doesn't really change anything and it still solves the problem. Okay, now let's go back to our original numbers and we're gonna take a look. So because at this point the critical tier is 0, nothing changes, your new critical chance and your critical damage still is the same, and therefore the values that I get will still be the same. Now if your weapon, like let's say the Dread, has I think a 50% base critical damage, then you can get into tier 1 crits. So you'll always see yellow crits, and every 25% of the time you're gonna see red crits. So what we're gonna do is that we first, as normal, we need to find out the damage of the weapon without critical, with just the base critical. And believe that there isn't a weapon that has a base critical of more than 100%, so you don't have to apply this whole idea of increasing the critical multiplier into this part. So this part is still basically the exact same thing as this thing, but the second part gets a little bit confusing. What I realized is that when doing this part is if its critical tier is 0, I can't use this formula, because 1 plus critical tier, which if it's 0 times something, is going to make this whole part 0, and it's going to be 1 plus 0. So your critical multiplier will stay as 1. It doesn't go up. So we have to define when the critical tier is 0, it does something else, and only when it's 1 and above can you use this formula to find your new critical multiplier. So that is the challenge, and what I did here is I introduced a what if sort of like coding. So if you guys do coding, you know about the what if function. So in this case, I'll try to explain the best that I can. I'm sorry, I realized that it's actually kind of small, but anyways, okay. So over here you can see that if the over here is the critical tier. If the critical tier equals to 0, then do this, and this is basically the same as this. The top one is exactly the same, so it's the same formula if the critical tier is 0. But but if not, so if yes, it does this, if not, it does this right after the comma, and this is where we implemented this critical multiplier. Okay, so first you see 100, which is the damage that we're doing, the thing that we define, just so that it's a little bit easier on the eyes. And then we have 1 minus this value, which is your critical chance for over here. This is so that we know how many is going to crit and how many not is going to crit. And in this case, I'm finding when it's not going to crit, and when it's not going to crit, it's going to still do yellow crits. And yellow crits can be solved with this formula over here, which is 4.4. You can actually take this value straight up the bat if you want to, but I find that it's more consistent if I use this value here, because later on when this one goes to tier 2 or tier 4 or tier 5, then this value is going to change. It's not going to be 4.4 anymore. It only works because it's at tier 1. I can use this value, but when it goes to tier 2, I need to use different value for maybe orange crits. So that is the first part, and then whoopsie. And then the second part is the critical damage. So again, you'll see something like if it's 0, then we do something else. But if it's not, now this is the easier part, because the first part is where, you know, your damage again times with the critical chance, which is this amount. So we know how much 25% is going to do the critical, and that 25% is going to do an extra 7.8 damage shown over here. And this value is already including with this formula. So this whole formula is actually this thing, 1 plus the critical tier times with the mod critical multiplier minus 1. You realize that over here my critical tier, I have a critical tier plus 1, because the critical tier tells you what tier you're in, but when it crits, it actually goes up 1 tier. So let's say I have 120% critical chance, so I'm in the yellow tier, so tier 1, but when it crits, it does orange crit, so it's actually a tier 2 crit, or rather a tier 2 critical multiplier. So that's why when it crits, when I'm in tier 1, I actually get a tier 2 damage. So that is how this part is being calculated, and then you add them up, you get a total damage, and then you differentiate or find the ratio between these, and you find that, oh, my damage actually increased by 38% damage, and that is a lot. So you can already see that the weapon's base damage or critical chance, stuff like that, plays a huge role in what is going to happen to the weapon and how much extra damage is that going to be given to you. So I'm actually gonna wrap things up real quick. I'm just trying to share with you the idea here and what to do, so that in case you want to make your own, or if you want to check my numbers or things like that, you can do so. Again, this will work for any I guess any games that has critical in it. If you know the critical chance, if you know the critical multiplier, you can just put in the numbers and you can see how much damage multiplier it actually gives you in relative to a damage mod, multi-shot mod, elemental damage mod, attack speed, faction mods, critical. Now that I think about it, I'm not too sure about condition overload. That might actually be a separate multiplier as well. I think that's why it's so good. So over here I have another sheet which I didn't really name them. It's just a copy of the second sheet and it's the better version. So you put in the values that you want to see and then it will generate. All the blue ones are just things that it will self-generate, and then after that you're gonna see the ratio changes over here. So you're gonna base off this to make your decision. Now this is really good because again, let's say you have 2 slots left, you know your damage multipliers, you just kind of like compare that way. So if you want to put 2 elemental mods, which is a total of, let's say one is 90%, then it's a total of 180%, and then you can put this in to see how much does it give your weapon. And if it's less than 180%, then critical is not the way to go. But if that particular weapon already have elemental mods on, then you have to recalculate because it's different. You have to actually take the damage and then multiply by the that multiplier before you add the other two. It's a little bit tougher to explain, but I'm going to try and do this before I end the video. So let's say you have 4 slots, okay? You have 4 slots and the first 2 slots you have elemental mod in, let's say 180%. So 90%, 90%. I'm gonna change this to 0.9, 0.9. And then after that, you are going to have 2 more slots that you want to put in, and you're not too sure if you should go for a critical or if you want to put in 2 other elemental mods to give it another 0.9 and 0.9, or you can go for critical. So let's just see how much damage it will actually affect. So if your base damage is 100, then you increase this base damage by 360%, because if you equal, I wonder if you can do it this way, equal some bracket. I know you can do it. Ooh, I guess you can. There you go. So you get a total of 360% increase out of 100. So you take 100 multiplied by 360%. Oh my god. I'm sorry. I'm trying to do this at a fly without preparing, and you get 360 damage. Now let's say if we replace these 2 mods for critical mods, for a 1.5 critical chance and also a critical damage of 1.2. Okay, I realized something. You also need to increase this damage by your base critical chance and critical damage, which we already calculated. If this is the case, it's going to be an extra 20%. So this value is going to increase by another extra 20%. So let's do that right now. Bracket. So just times 1.2, that will give it an extra 20%. Okay, now we take a look and see if this same weapon with this critical chance, if I were to remove this and add this amount into it, will it be better or worse? So let's say I were to take out this 2. So now my just elemental mods is going to be 180%. Okay, and then that will mean my 100 damage, 100 is going to multiply by this value. I keep forgetting to put the equal sign. Yikes. Okay, multiply by this value, and then the next step is it's going to multiply again because of the increase in what do you call, in the critical, by 20%. So multiply by 1.2, and it's relatively low, but then now it increases by an extra 1.25. So extra 1.25. So I have to multiply by 2.25, and you'll see that turns out if you have a weapon that has 20% critical chance and 2 critical multiplier, and instead of putting 4 elemental mods in, you can put 2 elemental mods and 1 vital sense and 1 point strike to give you more damage than you would with 4 elemental mods. Now obviously this does not include status effect yet, and maybe you can use dual set mods instead and have the effect, and the effect is going to do something. But first we have to get our basics right. We need to know how does the critical is being calculated before we can start comparing. So this is one way to find the damage increase due to critical in a percentage similar to the damage mods, the multi-shot mods, all these other mods. Now eventually we are going to compare with status, and I already have like sort of an idea how we can break down status into these numbers as well, sort of like damage multiplier where you can compare. But that's going to be for a future video. Tomorrow's video we are going to put this in sort of like a test run. We're going to go into Simulacrum. We're going to base off this spreadsheet to find out if certain multiplier makes sense with the criticals and everything like that. And also I'm going to show you how you're going to use this in your actual modding to find the highest damage potential. So you can actually see this thing at the side here, which I created. But yeah, anyways, in the next video I'm going to show you guys how I do that. I'm going to post the link to this spreadsheet at the comments. Feel free to go in and play around. Let me know what you find interesting at the comments or even at Discord. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye bye. Stay safe, clean, and stuff. Now I understand that this whole video and the last one could be somewhat boring and also hard to understand, because if you don't get one point, you might not get the whole idea, and the fact that I'm actually explaining how it works, and if you don't understand the front part, the whole video kind of just mess things up. But the takeaway here, or rather the summary, in case you really don't get how everything's being calculated, the takeaway here is that this value over here tells you the damage multiplier for criticals, and you can use this to compare with all the other multipliers. So remember, the more multiplier you have, the better it is. So even things like the faction mods that gives you only like 30% extra damage, it's huge if you do not have this multiplier on already. So take this as a separate multiplier and then put it into your overall build and see if that actually improves the build or not. And in the next video I'm going to show you how to do it. Yep, that's what we're doing.